This is a presentation about interference from Spanish into English, particularly as it concerns translation. And it's around us all the time. Here's an example I'm facing actually this week when I try to put the number of the numero di supporte. I don't know what that is. I think it's the registration number on the back of my residence permit in Spain. And I said, it introduces the number of support. God, what the hell happened? If I back translate, I think it says something like introduzca, all right, with the personal pronoun missing. So somebody has supposed that, I don't know what it is, it's just hopeless machine translation, but even machine translation is not that bad. It should be put in or enter the number of the registration number that's on the back of your card, okay? Would make sense. Incorrect, of course, I got it wrong. It revises. No, I think they mean revise or check and enter again, okay? In some minutes, okay? But we put up with this all the time. Look, machine translation AI is better than this. This is just some idiot employed by some idiot government. But it's all around us. Here's a beautiful one. There are whole websites full of this. Exit only, éxito aquí. Yeah, success. All right. It's clear false friend. People who don't know or don't know the languages fall into it all the time. What should happen classically is like this, where each language has its own way of expressing it, and the false friends are avoided, and the syntactic calques are avoided as well. This is what happens without translators. This is what should happen with translators in classical equivalence theory. But we're no longer there, and this talk is going to mess up that a little bit. Here's a text that we actually did in class, and we looked at how to translate these things in English, and it was really quite difficult. Some of the problems did involve false friends, but not all of them. The really clear false friend was this one, comodidad, which means ease, easy living. Confort, comodidad might be comfortable living or comfortable lifestyle. And comodidad, a commodity in English is a mercancía. So nothing to do with it. If you put in commodity, nobody's really going to know what's going on. And the other things, false friends, yes, but even so, parking in Spanish is not the same as parking in English. But here it is if you translate it as parking undercover, okay, because it's an abstract noun, whereas it would be a parking lot or a parking place, undercover or covered parking place. Others are just straight translation problems, and I invite you to play with that. It's not germane to what we're doing here. One of the good ways of doing it is to find a corresponding advertisement in English and pick up the phrases that are used there. That is, you do your terminology and phraseology mining on the basis of a parallel text. More interesting, perhaps, is what's happening here. This is from the Barcelona courtroom. It's from Judith Reigal's doctoral thesis, which I had the great honor and pleasure of supervising, which is how I came into contact with these examples, basically from Judith. Okay. We've got the prosecutor, the interpreter, and the judge. And the prosecutor says to the interpreter, pregúntale si es cierto que dos chicos le retuvieron. So that two lads, two boys, stopped her in some way, okay, or restrained her, or stopped her from moving. And the interpreter renders that as detain you. And as soon as she does, the judge has got detain, what? It's wrong, says the judge. Two men, the interpreter has another go, and again says detain. And judge says, es que detain tampoco existe, señor intérprete. Yo no sé su nivel de inglés. All right. So what's happening here is a little more complicated than the interpreter making a mistake, I suggest. And it's a little more complicated than detained being a false friend. Detener, detained, being a false friend. Now, if you look at it in the dictionaries, as I did here, retener, impedir que algo, alguien siga, salga, se mueve o desaparezca. All right, so this, okay, the boys stopped the woman until the police came up. Fair enough. Detener has two meanings. Very similar one, okay, in Spanish, but then a legalistic one, okay, arrestar, prender, capturar, apresar, encarcelar. All right, so the judge is thinking of this meaning number two of detener, all right, and she's aware that it's a partial false friend of something else, detain, keep somebody in official place, okay. One man has been detained for questioning. So the police can detain, but not just two guys in the street. So the judge has assumed that detained corresponds here for the two and that it's inappropriate. And she is not aware of this more relaxed, more general sense of detain in English, which does exist. And then you've got detained to delay somebody. He's been detained at a meeting. Okay. Sorry, this is where the more relaxed sense does exist. Stop them from going somewhere, which is what actually happened. Now, I can agree with the judge that there is a better way of saying that, and that would be retained or stopped. Okay. But I don't agree with her that detained is clearly wrong, because there is this sense here, and the Spanish sense does have a range of meanings beyond the legalistic one. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the judge has internalized a fear of false friend, okay? That detener is not always the same as to detain, and that to detain, she thinks, must have the same legalistic meaning as it does in English, which is not always the case. Now, what's interesting here is that the interpreter then defended herself by saying, look, the defendant understood perfectly what I was talking about and was able to answer. So what's the problem? You know, if this use of English is used and understood and the dialogue proceeds and there's no evidence of misunderstanding, what's the problem? The problem, I suggest, is the judge's fear of the false friends, of the non-corresponding terms, and certitude that she does understand it entirely in English. But she doesn't. Same judge, same interpreter. This is a little more complicated, perhaps. Okay, so there were these two guys, and the accused, the defendant, con otras mujeres, bueno, las dos, les sustrajeron los móviles, sustrajeron, took away, you took away their mobile phones. Right. Now, you tried to rob them. Right. No, I didn't. Judge, robar? You must say steal, because you can't have robar. Note the judge has got the English term rob, and the judge has translated that into robar. Not, says judge. No se dice. Como ha dicho, rob, no. Now, why is it the judge is going ballistic here? The judge is saying rob is wrong. Has dicho la palabra robar. And then the interpreter does change, steal a mobile phone from a man. And the accused is still saying no. I mean, it makes no difference. The accused says no here and says no over here. So all this problem of rob, steal is irrelevant to the actual exchange that goes on. Why is the judge worried about this? If your mobile phone gets stolen, it is the correct term, and it's worth more than 400 euros, es un robo. robo, robo in Spanish. If it's less, it's hurto, lesser crime, okay, or non-crime, a misdemeanor. So for the judge, the term robar has a technical meaning in Spanish. But you know what? It doesn't have that technical meaning in English, where to rob, the problem is actually not about the value or the style of the crime, it's about the directionality of the action. I rob a person of a phone and I steal the phone. Okay, so there are two verbs there. They can be used differently with different syntactic functions, but in actual practice, they're very close. The English dictionary I got here was to take something away from them by force, steal from. So synonym, steal, okay? But note that I asked GPT for this one, and it's actually quite good. You steal a phone, but you rob someone of their phone if you're describing an action where force is involved, okay? And interestingly enough, the verb there, sustraer, applies to hurtar and robar, all right? So it's a non-technical sense. Now, my problem here is that the judge on these two occasions is aware of false friends in the legalistic domain, but extends that awareness to the whole of the language erroneously and assumes a non-communication between the interpreter and the defendant, where in fact the communication, to all intents and purposes, is happening well enough, quite independently of the false friends. So there's this kind of hyper-awareness of false friends that actually gets in the way of effective communication. This is of some interest when we get to, I have to do something here. The screen's probably gone black, and here we get back here. Okay, when we get to what's called the false friends hypothesis from a recent publication, 2023, where the researchers find on the basis of corpus analysis that the level of cognateness between two languages, that is, the closer the two languages are together, the more structures and elements are shared, the more translators will be hesitant to use cognate translations. So words that have similar origins but different meanings, the false friends we'd be looking at, they will move away from them. Okay, now Spanish and English are highly cognate, many shared features and structures. And so we would suspect on the basis of this hypothesis that there are avoidance strategies, that people don't want to go there. Just like the judge. The judge is aware of those as danger areas, but she's pretty sure she knows, so she wants to go there and insist, whereas many translators and interpreters don't go there. How do you do this? By using a different term. The example given by these authors is from English into Dutch, English brave, valiente, Dutch braaf, brave, yes, but also good, well-behaved. It's like in French, un brave type is a good guy. Okay, it doesn't mean he's brave, he's just a good guy. So if you want brave in English, you would tend to go to medig, brave, which is the word that's more closely, directly associated with brave, and you don't get this confusion of the false friend. Examples that we've been looking at: robar, English to rob; false friends or fickle friends, there is an overlap, but it's not exactly the same. So the judge wants to go to steal. So there's no evidence or no suggestion of a confusion of meanings. The other example, detener, detain, possibly overlapping meanings, okay? But if you wanted to avoid that, you would go to arrest if you're talking about the police. Stopping the person, not the two boys in the street. Okay, so that's the false friends hypothesis. It's an avoidance strategy that we find going on there. You can see it here in this example. A classic. You've been doing this forever in your English classes. The lists of false friends are all over the place. Sensible is sensitive, whereas sensible is sensato. I hope you know that because I've been teaching that for more years than I care to remember. So, tengo la piel muy sensible would be, I have very sensitive skin, just applying this here. But if you're aware that there's a confusion here, because it is confusing, and you're an interpreter in the booth, for example, you need something quick on the fly, and that's going to take a lot of cognitive effort, you know what you do? I have very delicate skin, no problem. Okay, avoidance strategy. You've made a very sensible choice. This is muy sensato. Very good translation, but you've chosen wisely. Sometimes it's easier to do that kind of reformulation than to remember the non-correspondence of terms in this particular case. Okay, so those would be avoidance strategies. There's also omission strategies. Here's a classic one. This is a problematic one for many of us in the university system. Spanish profesor is an English teacher. No problem with that. But a catedrático is a professor. But in the United States, a professor can be a Spanish professor, means teacher. Or anybody teaching in a university gets called a professor. In the UK, only the full professor, catedrático, is the professor. So there's a danger area there. You've got to know where you are in the English-speaking world in order to translate that. So professor catedrático. You got that? That's a mess, a danger area. But if I'm translating a sentence like this, as I had to recently, I can avoid it. I can't avoid that one, titular, but that's easy. That has an equivalent. It's tenure. Soy titular means I have tenure or I am tenured. All right. Tied down. Yeah. Anyway, a way to translate that while avoiding these false friends is this: I gained tenure in 1997, or I have had tenure since 1997, or I am tenured. Yeah? I have been tenured since 1997. Okay. What did I do? I've got that problematic term. I don't want to go in there, too complicated. I leave it out. And the translation's fine. Somebody who's tenured is by definition a university teacher of some kind. Probably not a catedrático. All right. Now, a little bit of theory here. I don't really teach theory in this particular master's, but sometimes a few ideas can make us think. And I don't want to give just a remedial English class because you've been doing that for too many years, as have I. This is Gideon Turi. He's writing in 1995. And he's talking about what he calls a law of interference. And there are many versions of this law, but this is the one that interests me most. Tolerance of interference tends to increase when translation is carried out from a major or highly prestigious language or culture, especially if the target language culture is minor or weak. So Turi was actually working on the relation between English as a major world language and culture and Hebrew as a small, developing, ancient language trying to bring itself into modernity. All right. And to do that, the language had to develop enormously, and to develop it had to draw on other languages, notably English, but also German and Russian, when they got all those Russian immigrants coming in. But so in that sense, English would be in the position of the highly prestigious language or culture, and the target language was Hebrew, and interference was tolerated. So a lot of those apparently false friends would be brought in and become Hebrew words. Syntactic expressions would become part of Hebrew. In the same culture, that same translation culture, there were numerous pseudo-translations. Cowboy Western novels, to be prestigious, to sell, had to look like translations. So somebody would write them directly in Hebrew, but pretend to be a translator and put in lots of markers of interference from English to pretend to be a translation because that was prestigious. Now, I wonder if this applies to Spanish English, and I don't know if it does. I don't know if the Spanish language culture, in plural, see themselves as being inherently inferior to English language cultures. I don't think so. Far from it. There's awareness deep down that there was a great empire there. And it's still, there are three big languages in the world: Chinese, English, Spanish, and it's up there. They're competing. In class, we had an Italian speaker um, made the point that she thought that in Italian there was far more tolerance of interference from English than is the case in Spanish. But that would make sense because Italian has far fewer speakers than Spanish, and that means it has a smaller publishing and film industry and distribution network and business networks that Spanish can do more and can feel more prestigious just because of the size of the numbers of speakers and the economies that use the language. So in that sense, it might work. It's also interesting to ask if English tolerates interference through translations and generally doesn't. It's been accused of domesticating a lot. If you hear about domestication in translation, that means not tolerating interference into your language, whereas foreignizing would be tolerating it, borrowing things in, bringing it into your language. English has been accused of domesticating and not foreignizing in its translation culture. Sometimes that may be true. It depends a lot, though, on the particular part of the culture and where you are. 2 points. French is very prestigious still for some parts of English culture, particularly literary theory, critique, and philosophy. So academics writing in those areas will tend to absorb French words and French syntactic structures into their English. That still happens. The other point is that English is a huge world language with more L2 speakers than L1 speakers. So more people are using it as a second language than people have it as a first language. And that means we have enormous non-central usages and different kinds of English all over the world being mixed with what were pidgins and then Creoles, or just simply mixed with the presence of other languages. So there's tremendous interference in English outside of its central cultures, and the majority of people are L2s. So in that Barcelona courtroom, we were looking at a dialogue between L2 interpreter, L2 defendant, L2 judge, three non-native speakers of English arguing about what's correct in English. They're free to do it. The English language culture is remarkably weak in its centralized authorities. We have the style sheets that we mentioned. We don't have an academy. We don't have a state structure behind the purity of the language. Another thing that Turi says there is also of interest and perhaps even more important. Even when a translator tries to act as a gatekeeper to protect the purity of the language, to get rid of interference, they tend to do that at the level of the word, phrase, or sentence. So any structures bigger than sentence level, like paragraph organization, or the way a text is organized, or the way one idea is supposed to connect with another, the way causation is expressed, anything on that wider textual level tend to come straight in. Translators do not see it as their duty to defend a text genre or text type, for example. They just tend to work on the small things. Why? Because to change the big things takes a lot of work, and you have to pay people a lot, to rewrite that as it would be in a Spanish text. So that means that even though translators may adopt a gatekeeping, domesticating, purist kind of language preference, big things come in anyway. I was saying that authority in English is diffuse, is not well defined. I think there's a new kid on the block. I think new things are happening in the world of what's correct in English, and it's happening through technology, through automation. Machine translation is one thing, but generative AI is another. And here we've got a form of generative AI. This is actually Grammarly. Okay, I'm sure you get Grammarly whenever you write a text, and it's correcting it for you or telling you how to correct your text, suggesting, okay, it's revising, but it seems to be imposing certain kinds of logic. This is an abstract of one of my own articles, and you can see the Grammarly has corrected me or made suggestions. So the blue line is a suggestion. It wants me to take that phrase, there has been a progressive specialization of associations, and put it up there. Okay, shows that. So that there's the verb is next to the object of the verb. That makes good sense. Okay. However, in my sentence, I want that to be at the end because that's what I'm going to talk about. It's an end focus. Okay. So I've made a stylistic choice, but Grammarly has applied a rule to contradict my stylistic choice. I say, thank you very much, Grammarly, but I don't like your choice here. I am going to make my choice for my English. And sometimes I suggest we have to do that. Okay. Let's try another example. In rough chronological order, in roughly chronological order. Okay, it can be an adjective, rough order, it's an adjective. Or roughly, it can be an adverbial, qualifying chronological. No difference. I say, well, thank you, Grammarly. That's very helpful. I've thought about it, and I'm going to dismiss your suggestion. Here, a point raised earlier in the class, actually, do we need this comma or not? This is the Oxford or Harvard comma or the intrusive comma, depending on how you see things. It wants it, okay? American English will tend to use that comma, A, B, comma, and C, whereas British English will tend not to. And in this case, I decided not to because I was publishing actually in the Netherlands. So, it doesn't recognize a technical term. Complexity is a technical term in network theory. It thinks I wanted to say complexity, which is a non-technical term or less technical, more frequent. No, it's wrong. I said plexity. I wanted to say plexity. And here, anytime I say on the basis of, it changes to based on. And I must admit, there I just accept it, but I can't for the life of me see any substantial difference between these two. I don't know where this authority comes from, but the more these suggestions get thrown at us, the more people will correct it, the more that will sound normal, and the more it will become the norm. So these automated uses of English, the style of English that comes out of Gen AI models will, I think, tend to become what's normal in English and become authoritative just through usage. The result, as picked up in this paper by Karen Bennett, may be epistemicide. Epistemicide, like genocide. Genocide means killing off a whole people. Epistemicide means that the use of translation, which allows interference to come into a language and take over, can kill off a whole way of thinking. And that this may be bad for the diversity of human cultures if the whole world starts to think like capitalist commercial English from the United States. The critique is there, and it has to do with interference and tolerance of interference. That critique suggests that it is good for translators to domesticate, to be gatekeepers, to protect what they see as being the purity of their language. However, I hasten to point out that when going into English, one, purity is often very impure. It's mostly an illusion because of the diffuse nature of authority. There's only those style sheets and the many L2 speakers of English which give it a vitality and a degree of unregulated discourse that makes it far more open and able to tolerate diversity. And then Bennett is particularly talking of work going out from English into other cultures, in which case it's for the translators working into those other cultures to deal with it as best they can. I don't think, though, that we should be overly concerned about defending a culture against false friends, that we can get hung up on things, and those small things that translators tend to work on are not going to kill any culture. The big things, which are text type, text genres, the whole fields of discourse, the movement of sciences, the invasion, if you like, of different academic disciplines, and let's say it, university structures, which have overtaken the whole world. Those would be the elements of epistemicide, for better or for worse. Do not blame the translators who avoid or omit false friends for epistemicide. That was just to give you something to think about as you do this week's activity.